I'm Chris Bennett, and I recently retired from the World Bank after 17 years, where I was a lead transport specialist, and I led the World Bank's infrastructure work in the transport sector for the Pacific Islands. And in that context, climate change and climate adaptation was really quite important for us because the Pacific Islands are kind of like the canary in the coal mine when it comes to the effect of climate change on infrastructure and people. Yeah, one of the challenges that we have is a lot of people get bogged down into the origins and the nature of climate change. Is it natural? Is it due to climate temperature variations? Is it due to man's impact? That debate's actually really not very fruitful. Why? Because we know the climate's changing. One example, I was working in Tonga and we were looking at rebuilding the fire station at the airport. And one of the requirements that you have when you're doing a critical community infrastructure like that is that you design for the building code, let's say level 4 cyclones, and then you add one more level to that because just in case it's the worst situation. So I had this discussion with the government of Tonga, and they were saying, no, we've never had a Category 5 cyclone history here. You're being crazy, but we insisted on it. Well, a week later, they had a Category 5 cyclone. First time in history. I was working up in Tuvalu and Kiribati, and they used to have the saying that they were the places where cyclones were created, but they were the gift to the neighbors because they never hit those two countries. Well, you had cyclones hitting Tuvalu about 2013, 2014. So we're seeing in the islands temperature changes, climatic changes that have never happened before in history. And so why it's happening is not important. The issue is it is happening, and how do you therefore plan for that to ensure that you're managing the infrastructure correctly? So traditionally, we've had a pretty stable environment to do asset management under, and so you would have these standard business processes. But now, with the overlaying of climate change, there's a great degree of uncertainty and risk, which you just can't cater for in the business as usual processes. For example, if you're doing performance based contracting, what you find is that the impact of climate change uncertainty comes in through the force majeure elements of your contract. So here you are as a road agency saying, fine, for the next 20 years we're going to have a $10 million contract, but you can't actually control that because in some years it may be higher. We're finding in places, for example, like Armenia, up to 1/3 of the total cost on a contract can be due to climate change related incidents. So you've got to sort of reset how you're doing your businesses to acknowledge uncertainty and then build that in so that you're reducing the future risk. Often it can be just by looking at your standards. One example I can give you is I was working up in Timor-Leste doing a road project, and the only company manufacturing culverts had a 250 mil diameter culvert. That was all they were using. But as we were seeing the increased intensity of the rainstorms, often shorter duration but higher intensity, there was not the hydraulic capacity in the culverts to meet that. So we need much larger culverts. The design engineer said to me, well, we can't buy those. And my comment was, well, if we put them in the design specifications, then someone's going to build them. And so they were so stuck on their old standards that they couldn't see that these are actually contributing to the roads failing. And we need to move on from all of those. So the way which I often articulate this is when you think back to the 19th century when people like the British were building the railways in India, they didn't have a long history of temperature and rainfall durations. They basically factored into their designs reasonable safety factors to account for the uncertainties. Now, as our understanding of technology and process has improved, we've really cut back on those as in a way of being more efficient and more effective. Unfortunately, those times are past. We're moving into a time of greater uncertainty, decision making under uncertainty. So we need to sort of move back to the way of thinking, saying, right, how do we have the best solution for the current uncertainty and challenge from climate change? One example in New Zealand context is I live in Golden Bay, and we have State Highway 60 over the Takaka Hill, which got trashed 3 years ago by Cyclone Gita. And we still only have one lane after 3 years. That's an interesting contractual story. But I actually met up with NZTA and said, so have you considered doing a concrete pavement for some of these vulnerable sections? And they said, really? No one suggested a concrete pavement to us. And I said, yeah, in the islands, that's what we would be doing because we realize that we simply can't go back and keep on maintaining and repairing thin surfacings. So in some places where there's high vulnerability, you just want to have a very heavy mass of concrete there, accept the road's going to be closed for 3 or 4 hours due to it being overtopped, and then just send in a front end digger to remove it. We need to start thinking differently. We need to say, what are the risks? How do we change our business processes, both in terms of design, construction, and maintenance? Because if we don't do that, we'll have continued situations like we have here in Golden Bay. Some years ago, I did the first study looking at how to integrate climate change into asset management. And what really came through from that was that all of our approaches were based on historical understandings and not reflecting the uncertainties and the changing conditions that we have. If you begin to integrate climate change issues, such as I mentioned, higher intensity rainfalls, shorter durations, the impact of temperature on your pavement design, the way that your bitumen may be softening much faster, you get higher rutting or you get stripping of the pavements, a whole bunch of things happen. You have to factor these in because otherwise you're making long 10-year planning decisions based on faulty information, faulty assumptions. We all know that the further ahead we go, the less reliable our predictions are. But by not factoring in climate change, you're introducing a whole other layers of uncertainty. And really, the place to start is by effectively saying, what is the serviceability outcomes that we want given these uncertainties? And it may be that we accept that we'll have roads closed for periods of time because we simply can't afford to keep them open. But then your asset management processes should reflect that. You have, for example, equipment station nearby. You have in place maintenance procedures ready to respond. There's a whole framework of decision making, contractual elements, as I mentioned before, having climate change into your, not treating it as force majeure, but treating it as sharing the risks. Because currently, if you don't have it properly in your asset management, generally all the risk falls on the client, not on the contractors. And that's the way contracts are structured. So these are all multiple areas where there's a strong need to have a systematic framework for addressing climate change. And that, I hope, it will be the outcome of this project. You'll better understand, or this course I should say, you'll better understand what the issues are in climate change, how you can look at it, the way that you can improve your efficiency of business processes, and how to manage your contractors and infrastructure better.